All right, hello everybody. Welcome back to history class. Unfortunately, today we do have a snow day, so we can't see each other in person and have our normal conversation. But fortunately for you, we're still going to get to talk about what our next topic would have been, which is our next dynasty in China. You should have already completed the entry tickets that's posted in the daily agenda. So if you haven't yet, go ahead and scoot back to the daily agenda and complete that. And then there will be an exit ticket at the end of the video as well. But while I'm going through, there will be some questions that will pop up. You go ahead and answer those. It'll tell you how many sentences and all of that as you go along. So just follow the instructions and then you'll be good to go. All right. When we started our unit on China, we talked about what our theme would be. And this is the question that we're going to try to answer at the end of this unit for our final project. So the question or the theme is, which dynasty unified China most successfully? So we've already talked about the Han Dynasty. Today we're going to talk about a different dynasty, and it's actually kind of perfect for today, seeing as we can't really be in our normal environment. We get to talk about one of the shorter dynasties, which is the Sui Dynasty, SUI. It lasts from 581 to 618. So this is a completely medieval dynasty, unlike the Han, which kind of started in the ancient period and kind of ends in the medieval period. This one is completely medieval and picks up after the Han Dynasty. So we're talking about the beginning of the 6th century. China is still at war with itself, right? So after the Han Dynasty, China just kind of crumbles into different kingdoms. It's called the Three Kingdom period, in which there are 3 kingdoms, and you can see on the map what the names of those kingdoms are. We're not going to cover them too much in depth because it's not really a unified China at that point, so it doesn't really, concern us that much. But during the Three Kingdom period, there is a lot of fighting going on, and obviously each of those kingdoms wants to install themselves as, the main power. So after a couple of centuries of fighting amongst the 3 kingdoms, there's a military commander in the north who eventually kind of takes power, raises a massive army of nearly 500,000 troops. He even builds these giant ships that have 5 decks. You can see a picture of them in this video. And he sort of just travels down the rivers and defeats the southern kingdoms. So in 589, the South falls and China becomes one empire once again under this military commander who ends up naming himself Emperor Wendi. Wendi, not like the place with the hamburgers and the Frosties, but Wendi, Wendi.
Dude, this is a Wendy's restaurant.
So this is the beginning of the Sui Dynasty. Now, the Sui Dynasty is going to, at the beginning, try to avoid some of the mistakes that the Han Dynasty made that we saw at the end of last week. You guys will recall some of those mistakes. Some of them are pretty striking. Obviously, the Great Wall was one of them that we talked about. And then, of course, all of the people manipulating the young child emperors and trying to kind of do what they want. That made a lot of people sort of lose respect for that system, and their society kind of crumbled apart. So what the Sui Dynasty is going to try to do is make some reforms. We talked about what a reform was actually for our History Day project. So you'll recall a reform is a change that a society makes or a government makes to try to improve something, maybe make it more fair or make it work a little bit better. So they are going to make some key reforms, and that'll be kind of the main topic of this video as we go along. So let's talk about the first reform that the Sui Dynasty makes. The first reform that they make is that they bring back the civil service exams for government jobs. We saw at the end of the Han Dynasty, they had stopped using these civil service exams for government jobs, and instead they were kind of like selling them, or the empress was giving them to her family or her friends or people that she wanted in those positions. So that was very destructive for the Han Dynasty. So the Sui Dynasty is going to try to avoid that by going back to the civil service exams. And they're even going to take one step further. So another reform that they make is that the officials who actually pass the exam are going to be removed from the provinces or the areas that they were born in, and they're going to be sent to live and work in different areas. This way, they avoid any possible corruption. They think it'll make it less likely that people will make shady deals or be corrupt if they are doing their job in a different place. They'll have less connections, they'll know less people, and they'll be less likely to show favoritism or take bribes or things like that. They also limit these government workers to terms of 4 years. So after 4 years, there's a process they have to go through to keep their job, but their term limits also prevent corruption, bribery, and things like that, right? Because they have to keep their job even after they get it, right? They have to earn it back. So the second reform has to do with farming. We talked about the land inheritance system in China where after, the father dies, he kind of leaves his land and it's kind of split evenly amongst his kids. Well, if you keep splitting things evenly, after a while, there's pretty much no land left to go around, right? So one way that they're going to try to fix that and also fix these landlords from gaining all the land or buying up all the land is by reforming how the land inheritance system works. So as you can imagine, after a couple of centuries of fighting and war, the Sui dynasty really needs to get their farms up and running. To get the peasants back to farming, the government claims all of this land, and every taxable man between 21 and 59, which is considered their working age, right? 21 to 59, is given 15 acres of land for farming. So in return for this, they have to pay taxes, obviously, right? They have to pay a grain tax. So part of what they produce has to go back to the emperor, the government. They also have to make a silk tax. So each household pays a certain amount of their tax in silk. That's where the women of their household obviously come in. We talked about how that's definitely a woman's job in this society, or considered a woman's job in this society. And that's how they contribute to their families and, their household is by creating or producing silk. And they also have to pay a labor tax. So all of these men who own this land or who are given this land have to work 20 days out of the year for the government, right? Where they are not paid, they're just working, right? That's how they're paying back for the land that they're getting. And when the person who is getting that land retires or passes on, the farmland is returned to the government and then redistributed to another 21 to 59-year-old. And this prevents large landowners from sucking up all of this land and buying it up and holding it for themselves, and makes it more likely that the peasants will actually be able to, support themselves. So that is another key reform that the Sui dynasty makes. So on the note of farmers, the third reform kind of has to do with farming, but it's more about how farm goods are distributed throughout the empire. So the south of China is where most of the agricultural goods are produced, right? It's where most of their food is grown. Now that has to do obviously with the climate and their access to water. The north is just not as easy of a place to grow a lot of food, but there are still a lot of large cities in the north and a lot of military strongholds. We talked about those groups who live to the north of China and are always kind of a looming threat for invasion or for, coming in, plundering and stealing things. So a lot of military strongholds and military power is located in the north. But if your food is made in the south and a lot of your people are in the north, well, how do you connect those two? This leads us to the third reform, which is Emperor Wendy decides to launch a huge project to connect both of China's major rivers, which are the Yellow River and the Yangtze River, by a canal that runs north to south. So both of the major rivers run east to west, right? So they're going to dig a canal that goes north to south and intersects both of them, and also connects many of these major cities in the north. And then they can use that canal for transporting agricultural goods, right? So they can take the food that they produce, mainly rice, in the south, and they can transport it to the north where most of the people are. And this will definitely be a force of, creating unity in China. So maybe an area of interest for your project at the end of this unit. because it quite literally is linking different parts of China and making it easier to transport and travel between both of them, right? So this way they kind of have a partnership, right? The northern cities in China can provide protection and security, and the southern cities in China, or the southern farms in China, can produce the food to sustain all of those cities. Now, of course, we have to talk about what the trouble with the Sui dynasty is, because as we know, it is a rather short dynasty from what we said at the beginning. So it has to do with the last reform, right? The canal, it's called the Grand Canal, because it is really, really massive, right? As you can imagine, digging a canal like that also goes through two major rivers can be very, very costly, both in terms of money and also in terms of human life, right? We talked about how building the Great Wall was, very devastating for the peasants of China because many people died during the construction. Well, the Grand Canal is pretty much just like that, right? So it's certainly likely that a lot of people perished during the construction of the Grand Canal just due to the fact that they were digging it by hand. And, they didn't have any heavy machinery like we do today to help them out. So this is obviously a huge drain on the peasants of this society, right? These are the people who are, like we said, forced to do 20 days of service to the government. But eventually, Emperor Wendy's son, whose name is Yang Di, is going to try to speed up the construction of this canal. And so things like that 20 days of service that the peasants sort of agreed to get their land from the government ends up becoming a little bit lengthened, right? Sometimes they're kept for several years instead of just 20 days. There's also a dedicated police force that's formed to monitor workers and make sure that they stay there until their work is complete. Women and children are also forced into labor as well, which kind of departs with what was normal during that time. Certainly in previous dynasties, it was not common for women and children to be forced into this labor. And then you also have to imagine the hardship that would come with all of these farmers, right? These are who these people are who agree to this forced labor. It is farmers, right? So they're taken away from their farms for, significant periods of time, and that's going to impact trading. That's going to impact the production of food. So there are going to be some negative aspects of digging the Grand Canal. In the long run, perhaps it is, very beneficial for society, but if your society cannot outlast the negative parts, which are, food production and people just generally being upset with their ruler because he's forcing them to do hard labor, then that doesn't matter very much, does it? So these are the reforms that the Sui made, and also some of maybe the potential drawbacks of those reforms. In your exit ticket, you are going to answer a question about this very thing with the Grand Canal. So I look forward to seeing what you guys' responses are. If you have any questions, let me know. You can email me. But otherwise, I hope that you have a good rest of your snow day. See you back in class.